Hey guys, it's Stu here. Decided to stream tonight. Don't need that, don't need that. We'll throw on some Be Bustas in a little bit. Oh no, I can't even put that right there. Jeez. How professional, right? So I'll be starting in a second. Just wanted to post this where I can. Come on, update. I am live, right? Hope I'm live. How come I can't find it? Oh, do I have it still private? Am I being a dum-dum? I'm being a dum-dum. No wonder I couldn't find it. Aren't I a dumbass? Ugh. Oh, that makes me a little bit dumb. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Forgive me, I am all like literally I have so much stuff going on in my room, like literally just like then like 3 feet. There's my desk, my bed, my chair, my laptop. It's going on. So I'm thinking about listening to some Be Busta. Make sure we're good here. Okay, looks like we're doing good. I don't hear myself though. Okay, there we go. Just give that a second. Oh, geez, I already have people in here. Hey, dude. Just give me a second here. I'm getting my stuff all together here. Yeah, I know I streamed prematurely, but just give me a sec. I'm trying to share this to my Facebook and all that, but I'll be getting everything set up in a sec. Jeez, that was quick. Oh, well, there he goes. That's fine. Wait until there's a couple of us in the chat here. Oh, so how's everybody doing? Yes, I know it's 1 o'clock Eastern time, but who cares? Oh, I'm tired. Full day at work, all the fun stuff. So I'll make sure this thing's all posted everywhere. What the hell is going on in the Republic? Christ. Okay, there we go. I see some people are doing some fan fictions, man. That's awesome. Alright. Let's see what I can start doing here.
Safety for us is the cornerstone of all of our training. Pipelines like Atlantic Sunrise are safe. Technology.
G'day mates, it's Be Busta here. So, I just wanted to let you guys know before the video starts that I'm going to be taking a lot of my videos over to Twitch from now on. If you want to find out more about why this is happening, hit me up on Twitter. But if you want all of my videos from now on, then you'll have to make a free Twitch account and follow me there. There'll be a link in the description if you'd like to do that. Also, I want to say a big thank you to all of those who have been supporting me financially on Patreon. With YouTube the way it's been lately, you guys have kept this all going, and I literally could not have done this without you, so thank you. And if others would like to support me to continue to do what I'm doing here, I'll leave a link in the description to my Patreon account. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoy the video, and let's begin. This is going to be long, as it is a long story that takes place over several years. I'm 23 years old right now. When I met the subject of this story, I was 15, so we're talking about 8 years. Get comfortable because here comes an overdose of backstory before we get to the good parts. Let's go back to September of 2010. My third period class in high school was Algebra 2. This is where I met John. John was a sophomore, so only about a year older than me. At first glance, I thought he was quite cute. I was already in a relationship, my first one ever, but it was quite rocky and doomed to collapse. I had a close friend named Bethany who, one day, came up to me and told me that John was interested in me and wanted to get to know me. My relationship with my first boyfriend ended only a couple of days before, and it seemed like the timing was on point. The very next day, during algebra class, John came up to me and sat down beside me when we were told to work on an assignment. John introduced himself and wasted no time in asking if I wanted to hang out with him after school. It was a Friday, which meant that there was a high school football game after school in the evening. I assumed he wanted me to stay with him until then, or else during the game and then afterwards. I immediately agreed to, much to his surprise and Bethany's. They would later admit. I'm not sure why I was immediately able to say yes, but looking back, I was quite lonely and rather upset after my first breakup and wanted a boy in my life. I texted my mum, telling her that I was going to stay after school to work on a project and then stay for the football game with Bethany and our friends. My mum agreed and told me she'd pick me up afterwards. I spent the rest of the day rather anxious, and when the final bell rang, I met up with John near the band room. The following couple of hours were amazing. We worked on schoolwork together, talked about our interests, hobbies, and the works. I was surprised to find that we had quite a bit in common. We both liked the same books, movies, music. We both loved to be outside. He did a lot of flirting that afternoon, and evening as well, which I must admit was very flattering and gave me butterflies. We went outside on a walk around the area after we finished up our schoolwork. He was very poetic in the way that he described and admired things like the trees, the air, the sky. I had never heard a boy say things like this before with such a poetic elegance, and it was beautiful. He was a beautiful boy, inside and out. He was also very intelligent and had a vocabulary that dwarfed even my own and the other smart kids in our school. He told very clever and funny jokes, and when we had a discussion, was easily able to intelligently explain and describe things in ways that I didn't even know were possible. Needless to say, I was falling for him. During the football game, we walked around and talked about our families and friends for the first time. John wasn't really open to talking about his family, and he told me that he didn't have any real friends, only acquaintances. He told me that no one really liked him, not even his family. I felt bad for him. If there was anything that I learned that afternoon that I spent with him, is that he was extremely likable. I could never imagine somebody not being able to like John. After the football game, he finally asked for my cell phone number, and I gave it to him. Before finally parting ways, he gave me a hug and thanked me for spending the day with him before his mum finally arrived to pick him up. The next day, my parents invite John over. John wastes no time introducing himself, and after only about an hour, it seemed like we were all a family. John talked to all of us about his hobbies, interests, and plans after high school. He seemed like a boy that really knew what he wanted out of life, and had all the motivation and ambition to be successful. My parents fell for him as much as I did, and after he left, had nothing but good things to say about John. I felt like this was the beginning of something really special. Before John left, he finally asked if I would be his girlfriend. My heart leapt at the opportunity. We exchanged a hug before he left, and he told me that he'd text me when he gets home. So, after some time passed, John came up to me one day and asked if I was finally able to come over to his house for a change. My dad wanted to meet his family beforehand, but John was always reluctant to do so. And after I said that I couldn't, he finally began to show a side of him that I didn't know existed. He expressed how much he disliked my dad. He expressed hostility towards him about how protective he is and whatnot. I simply explained that since I'm his only daughter, then it's to be expected. John didn't like that though. He still insisted that my dad was a stuck-up prick who only wanted things done his way. I'd never seen John like this before, and I felt worried. Yet, he simply laughed it off, saying that he was probably just overreacting, and that he apologized for saying what he said, and that nothing was wrong. Of course, he said it in such a convincing way that I believed him. We went along our day as usual, and we were still together by the time the summer came along. I spent that summer not talking to John after he explained that he was going on a summer-long trip with his family, but he would be back sometime in August. It wasn't until 2 weeks before school started. In August. It wasn't until 2 weeks before school started that John called me on a different phone number. I didn't question the number since I was just happy that I was speaking to him again. We talked for hours and caught up on things. He told me that he enjoyed his trip with his family and that things went well. I was really glad for him. He asked me if I could come over, but once again, I said that I couldn't. He didn't seem bothered by it, even happily saying that he'll stop by that weekend. For the next couple of months, John called me less often and kept to himself more. Finally, one day, he broke up with me, telling me that he was probably going to kill himself and wanted to be alone until then. I cried myself to sleep that night. I tried calling John's house phone every day to try and speak with his mum or dad over the course of the next week, but no one ever answered. He was at school, but he never even batted an eyelash at me. The rest of the school year went by, and so did summer. John, at this point, became a senior and was still alive and attending school while I became a junior. John and I had been separated for a long time up to this point. Then one day, sometime in December, about a week before his birthday, that's how I remember, he came up to me and asked if I wanted to get back together. I hesitated at first but agreed after thinking about it for a while. I didn't want John away from me any longer. I loved him. Gradually, his positive attitude and overall demeanor came back. He was back to the way he was before his depression. Before I knew it, things were great again. He came over a lot and we spoke on the phone every day. Things were perfect again. The school year went on smoothly, and by the time summer came along, John had officially graduated and I became a senior. During the summer, John and I spent almost every day together, either in person or on the phone, talking about our futures. John at one point said that he had a surprise waiting for me. 2 weeks later, on a beautiful Saturday night, John and I were laying down enjoying the starry sky. John told me to sit up and turn around until he said to look at him. He suddenly got down on his knee and pulled something out of his pocket. He told me to turn around, and it was a ring. He then asked if I would marry him. My heart leapt and I felt tears in my eyes. I hugged him and said that I would. Of course, being only 17 at the time and him 18, I would have to wait, but I didn't care. The love of my life had finally proposed to me. We shared a long kiss and an even longer hug before he departed for home. I spent my days at school thinking about John and what he was up to, and looked forward to talking to him after school. Each day around the same time, John would text me asking how my day was, and after school would call me. Life was good. That is, till about 5 months later. I unexpectedly got a call from John, even though he told me that he was going to be away that day. He called me upset. He told me that he was feeling depressed again. I asked him where he was, and he said that he was at his uncle's house in the backyard. I didn't know where his uncle lived and stayed on the line as he cried. Suddenly, he told me that our engagement was off. My heart broke again. I cried hysterically as John cried as well. He told me that he was going to end himself and that he loved me, and abruptly, the phone cut off. I cried for days on end and refused to go to school after that. I once again tried to contact him and his family, but to no avail. I was heartbroken. I was lost. I did some silly things over the span of the next year and ended up hospitalized on a couple of occasions. And not once did they ever try to contact John or his family, insisting that we leave them alone. And I agreed. I didn't want to see him ever again after he'd broken my heart that way. I eventually recovered and graduated high school. I began my life anew that summer and decided to put the past behind me and focus on the future. And now, to the meat and bones of the story. I hope you survived that overdose of context. Fast forward about a year after I graduated. This is when the letters began appearing in the mail. I had received letters from somebody whose name and address on the envelope was always different, who claimed to be in love with me. Every so often, maybe once a month, I would receive a letter from someone in the mail. My parents and I thought at first that it was someone other than John, given that John had never tried to contact me since our engagement broke off, and that his handwriting, when compared to notes that he had written to me before, were noticeably different. Each time I would receive a letter after the first one, I would immediately discard it, not wanting anything to do with whoever was writing them. I figured if I ignored the person that they would leave me alone. But boy, was I wrong. This continued for a little over a year. When the letters stopped arriving, nothing occurred for some time, until one day, John messaged me on Facebook, asking how I was doing, but I didn't reply. Honestly, I didn't want anything to do with him. I curiously looked at his profile, but it was all private, and the photo of him was old. I had seen it during the time that we were in high school, so it was definitely not a recent photo. Now, let's talk about when John began appearing around my area. It was the week following the 4th of July in 2015, around the same time the letters ceased to show up in my mailbox. I was on a walk with my dad and my niece when we all saw a car drive by us and stop just before the corner ahead of us. I didn't recognize the car, but I did recognize the person who got out of it. It was John, and oddly enough, he hadn't changed one bit since I saw him last. He wasn't the driver, so there was someone with him. We watched as he casually walked on the backside of the car and inspected one of the back tires. Well, at least that's what it looked like. I noticed that he was looking towards us every couple of seconds. My dad and I watched on for about a minute as I noted that it was John to my dad. My niece, confused, asked who John was. I said an old friend. My dad, a bit annoyed now, decided that we should turn around and head home. I could hear the sound of the car drive off shortly thereafter. My dad and I did wonder why John was in the area, but we coughed it up to coincidence. About a month later, my mum, dad and I are outside doing yard work. My mum and I are tending to our backyard garden when we both hear my dad yelling. "What do you think you're doing?"
Hi, Brian at Tom Hester Chevrolet in downtown Scranton, where we're relationship driven. Join us for the Freedom to Drive event going on now. Come celebrate.
Hear my dad yelling. "What do you think you're doing?" My mum and I got up and walked towards the front yard and watched as my dad walked towards our driveway, pointing and cursing at someone out of our line of sight towards the road. We then heard the sound of a car driving off. My dad explained that somebody was hiding behind a tree off to the side of our driveway and that he luckily spotted him as he tried to maneuver closer to our yard. At first we thought that it was somebody scoping out the house, possibly a burglar. There had been some burglaries in our area before. I asked my dad if he recognized who it was, but he said that he couldn't make out their face or any distinguishing characteristics. My dad did call the police and say that somebody was creeping around our house and possibly others. They sent out a squad car to patrol the area, but nothing came of that. Some time passes before I start receiving phone calls. I received a phone call late one evening, about 3 months after my dad chased the trespasser off of our property. I had gotten home from work and was relaxing on the couch with my dog watching a television show with my dad when I received a call from a number that I didn't recognize. I picked it up and this is how the call went. "Hello?" "Hello, Jacqueline." The man's voice was hushed and monotone. "Who is this?" "You know who." No I don't. I don't recognize your number." "Ah, that's too bad." At this point, my dad looked at me, confused. Who are you?" "I want to see you, one last time." "Wait, what?" There was silence after this. "What did you say?" The person hung up after this. I looked down at my phone, confused and anxious. I looked at my dad, concerned. He asked for the number's area code. He didn't recognize it as one in our county or state for that matter. And after Googling it, I found out that it was an area code from Vermont. That's more than a state away from me. He asked me who it was, and I said that I didn't know. John's old cell phone number had the same area code as mine, but at this point, I knew that if John was the one harassing me, that he was not going to let it be known so easily, as he's practically the paradigm of intelligence. I received 3 more calls from that number over the span of 3 days, each in the evening hours. I eventually changed my number, but unfortunately, this didn't stop the calls. Over the span of about 4 months, I kept receiving calls from unknown numbers, some with different area codes than the other ones. I stopped answering after the 3rd time, and each time I went to listen to the voice messages left by the numbers, there was nothing but silence, except for one which had the faint sound of a man talking, but I couldn't even make out whose voice it was, or what he was saying. I did go to the police, but of course, there was nothing that they could do. And it didn't end there. I was being constantly harassed by somebody who really wanted my attention. I at times thought it could have been John, but I didn't have any proof. The police told me that unless they had evidence to prove that he was harassing me, then they couldn't do anything either. I always knew that John was clever, so catching him seemed pretty hopeless. Fortunately, the phone calls eventually stopped. I was hoping whoever it was simply gave up, but they didn't. Once again, some time passes. I was pulling into my driveway early one evening after returning home from work. As I got out of my car and went towards my front door, I noticed a piece of paper taped to the door. My parents were away for the day, so I knew that no one was home. I never saw them leave a note behind before, which was really odd. I walked up to the door and read the note. This is what it said. "I miss you dearly. Not a day goes by that I don't think of you. I dream about you a lot, think about you a lot, and I will not rest peacefully until I see you one last time in my presence. Signed, your secret admirer." My heart pounded as I read the paper. I ripped the paper to shreds and felt angry. I stormed outside and just about frightened my dog as I went upstairs to change out of my work outfit. I was angry for the first time since all of this started with the letters. I had had enough. I'm sick of being harassed and crept out by this person. I called my mum and told her about the note. She was upset as well and told me to call the police. But what would they do? Nothing, just like before. If only this person would break into my house or something, then I would have something to make a case out of. But the door was locked, as were the others, and there was no sign of entry. Again, I felt hopelessly lost. Another year went by and nothing major happened, apart from the occasional letter. Yeah, that started up again. About once every 2 months I would receive one. But things finally began to die down. I had thought that this entire nightmare was finally over. But of course, I was wrong. I was asleep one night when I awoke to the sound of something knocking on my window. I got up in a trance-like state and walked to my bedroom window and opened the curtain. I saw nothing but trees. I lied back down, thinking that I was imagining things. But then, I heard it again. I got up again and looked out of the window. There was nothing but trees. I went downstairs and found my dad, who was awake, and told him that something was knocking on my window. He went outside and walked around the house before coming back inside. He told me that I was probably imagining it, and I went back to sleep. This happened again the following night. This time, my dad wasn't awake and I had to wake him. He grabbed his shotgun, walked outside again, and once again saw nobody. He did, however, hear the sound of a car driving away from near our driveway and called the police. They came by and inspected our doors and windows for any tampering, but to no avail. I went back to sleep an hour or so later on one of our couches. A week goes by and nothing new happens, and once again I thought it was all over. And it did finally end. The last thing that happened was back in late March of this year. My parents were sitting outside on our porch just before sunset while I was in the house playing with my niece, when somebody drove by our house and stopped down the street. My parents, who were obviously well aware of what was going on with me, got up and made their way towards our front yard and peered down the street. They were able to see somebody get out of the car and walk up one of our neighbors' driveways. Our neighbor's driveway leads to the side of their house, which isn't fenced off, and you can easily walk from their driveway to our backyard. My parents immediately came inside after my dad was finally able to recognize the person. It was John. My mum immediately called the police as we waited. My mum immediately called the police as we waited. My dad and mum had parked their cars in our almost never used garage that day, which probably explains why John was here now. Perhaps he thought that I was either here alone or no one was. And sure enough, not too long afterwards, we see John walking up towards our backyard from our neighbor's backyard, quietly and slowly through the trees. My dad has his shotgun ready as my niece and myself go upstairs into my bedroom. At last, after all these years, he's finally going to get what he deserved. I sat quietly with my niece as I waited for the shit show to go down. I finally heard my dad yelling out to John, asking him what he wants with us. I didn't hear John say a single word. My dad, stupidly, showed John that he was armed, and John took off running towards our neighbor's house. And by the time the police arrived, John had already vanished. But of course, we now knew who had been harassing and stalking me for the past several years. We finally decided, since we finally knew it was John who was behind all of this, that we're going to file a restraining order against him. We filed the temporary order first, and then finally the final protection order. And when I learned that John had to be there for the hearing, I felt afraid. And, to all of our surprise, he showed up and admitted to everything at the hearing. But yet, he didn't show a single ounce of remorse and even smirked a few times during the hearing. I think that he took pride in his work and was eager to show himself off to us. Honestly, it was bone-chilling. After After all the years that he spent harassing and stalking me, I still didn't know what he was capable of. But at least now he's legally bound to stay away, and I sure hope that he holds up his end of the agreement. Of course, if he breaks the agreement, he'll be locked up. But somehow, I think he's clever enough to get around it. I had plenty of paranormal experiences from a young age, but I didn't believe in the paranormal. I passed it off as my brain playing tricks on me because I was always alone when it happened. That is, until 5 years ago. My cousin, male, and me, also male, were walking through the abandoned part of an old army fort from the 16th century in our hometown in Croatia. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and we decided to go there because we were bored, and it also provided a shortcut to our houses. There is an old tunnel that's around 30 meters long that serves as an exit from the fort. It is the only exit in the fort that had no lighting inside of it, as that part was not renewed. It was pretty creepy, but we thought, screw it, and went in. After a few meters in, I felt this feeling of overwhelming dread pass through me. We stopped dead in our tracks and looked at each other. He felt it too. Then came the sound that I can only describe as a deep shriek that travelled from the end of the tunnel towards us and ended up in our heads. We couldn't move because it hurt our ears a lot. We heard what I could compare to that sound from COD when a grenade explodes near you. After a few seconds, he looked up ahead and screamed. I could barely hear him through the buzzing, but I looked up too and saw a huge shadow, at least 3 times as tall as a human, standing at the end of the tunnel. We couldn't move or talk for what seemed like 2 minutes. We were just standing there, frozen in fear. Then, all of a sudden, the shadow started moving, imagine gliding, towards us at the speed of fast walking. It came as close as 7 to 8 meters to us, and I honestly thought that we were about to die. Then, somehow, my cousin unfroze and pulled me with him in full sprint. We ran for 30 minutes without stopping until we reached our part of town, and we didn't look back the whole time. We both saw and heard the exact same thing. We slept in my place that night, covered in blankets over our heads like little pussies. And to this day, I can't explain this in any way.
I must have been 8, 9 years old, and it was hands down the most gorgeous game I've ever played.
I play Gran Turismo on every iteration of the game since the first one.
2, 3, 5.
This title just kind of, I don't know, it brought me back in. I was just astonished and amazed that it was so real.
Phenomenal. I don't know. This one felt like I was driving my own car.
Racing against other people, there's so much unpredictability, people making mistakes, trying to overtake you, being extremely aggressive.
I'm an aggressive driver, so I'll hit anybody.
Well, I try to be, I guess, polite.
I think I'm technical. But as far as competitive playing goes, there's nothing like it.
I used to be part of a search and rescue for Parks Canada, but that all changed after something I experienced in the foothills 3 years ago. The horror I witnessed is a juxtaposition to the beauty of the surrounding primal landscape. There is something special about this land which is difficult to explain. It's so peaceful. This whole area was considered to be a sacred place by the Aboriginal people. This area is inhabited by the mighty buffalo, grizzly bears, wolves, and mountain lions, among other prestigious animals. But there is something else that inhabits this land. Something that has gone unseen for an incomprehensible amount of time. Dare I say that this thing must have witnessed a millennia go by. For all intents and purposes, I call it a vampire. And I don't mean a pale man with slicked back hair and a black cape with an Eastern European accent or anything. In a way, this thing seemed almost like a force that has gone unseen in the wilderness, feeding off of unwary travelers. What it does to its prey is not unlike things we see in nature. It feeds like a parasite to continue its existence. This is, of course, me trying to make some kind of sense of what I witnessed, to have some kind of grasp on the situation, to keep things in order. That year was chaos due to the severe electrical storms that caused multiple forest fires, some of which were under control while others caused massive damage in other areas. Health advisory services were recommending anyone with existing health issues remain indoors and avoid strenuous activity. But even that didn't keep the most rugged or determined outdoorsmen away. Oftentimes the sky was hazy, with billowing smoke that went on for miles, carried by the wind. There were fire bans set in place. Anyone caught with a fire at a campsite, or even a fire pit in their backyard, could earn them a hefty fine. Let me tell you about that day. Normally, it would have been a bright sunny day, typical of the season during that time of year. However, the sunlight was blotted out by the heavy smoke that arrived pre-dawn. The trouble started during the middle of summer that year when a park ranger came across a reserved campsite that was in ruins. There was debris scattered all around the site. The tents had been shredded open, and one was even completely collapsed. The car windows were smashed in, and the roof had been torn open. The wreckage clearly showed that there was some kind of struggle here sometime during the night. As it turned out, there was a family of 4 that had been using this campsite. It was a father and mother with 2 daughters. The ranger determined that it was likely a bear attack, and he called in for backup. The RCMP were called to the scene alongside search and rescue teams, and a massive search for the missing family commenced. The group I was with was about 10 miles south away from the campsite. That is how far out the scent dogs brought us, but still, there was no sign of the family at all. How in the hell did we come all of this way without finding anything? There was no blood, no objects, nothing. There weren't even any footprints in the dirt, besides deer tracks. The area we ended up in was thick brush, dominated by brooding spruce trees and rocky cliffs. The canines started to act up. They began whining and howling with fright, tucking their tails between their legs, and hiding behind the dog handlers who were trying to control them. This was highly unusual. It's like they either saw or caught scent of something that they didn't like. But what was it? I was several meters behind the group who were arguing about the dogs and which direction to go. I kept glancing around because I started to feel anxious. Despite the summer heat, I had that strange sensation of someone walking over my grave, if you know what I mean. My whole body shivered, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up on end, and goosebumps formed on my skin. There was another feeling too, the indistinct feeling of being watched. I spun around, looking in every direction, looking at the trees and the rocks, but there was nothing of note to see. What happened next, I cannot truly explain. It was against procedure, but I felt compelled to start moving towards an old overgrown hiking trail in the southeast. I felt like I was being pulled by something unseen, but that notion didn't occur to me at the time. I just felt the need. Maybe I wanted to get away from the other search and rescue members who were arguing among each other, with the tracking dogs going crazy or something. Beyond the thick brush, I discovered a cave entrance in the ground. At the cave mouth, I spotted something bright. It was a child-sized shoe with pink stripes on the sides of it. I felt my heart sink into my chest.
Bigfoot!
I looked up at the smoky sky and let out a sigh. I noticed an opening in the dark hazy sky, and a beam of sunlight hit me in the face. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the opening in the ground. The sloping ground showed signs of something being dragged downwards. I let out a whimper as I entered the cave. I knew that there were caves in the area, but I had never actually gone into one alone. But as I stated, I felt like something was calling to me. That's honestly the only way that I can describe it. I had to crab walk through the entrance. When I reached the flat ground, I could stand fully upright. 20 feet into the cave, and the stagnant air took hold, and the darkness was becoming oppressive, but I continued pushing forwards. I stopped and listened very carefully. There was only complete silence and the unforgiving darkness. I shined the light around the cavern and spotted something on the wall. It was an ancient petroglyph carved right into the cave wall. It depicted men chasing a buffalo herd off of a cliff. I traced my finger along the primitive art. Pushing onward into the unknown, I found an object on the cavern floor. It was what appeared to be a very old leather canvas bag. I picked it up and blew the dust off of it. I unbuckled it and took a look inside. There was a rusted water canteen, a bronze compass, a leather-bound book, and, to my surprise, a very old-looking pistol. In fact, I later found out that it was a flintstock pistol, which was dated to 1715. I dropped to my knees and grabbed the book out of the bag. The writing on the cover read, "Les Demons." I remained still on my knees, trying to comprehend what I was seeing, trying to make sense when a noise startled me. It didn't sound like it was right next to me, but rather it came from somewhere deeper in the cave. It sounded like something being broken or snapped. I continued my search for the missing family. They had to be down here somewhere. The glow of the flashlight showed that I had to make my way down another slope, and at the bottom, I saw something that caused me to freeze. I saw a pair of feet, one barefoot, missing a shoe, the other wearing a white shoe with pink stripes. Tears began to well up in my eyes, and complete sadness had taken over me now. I had indeed found one of the missing family members, a young girl who couldn't have been older than 9. I gasped in horror at what I saw. First was the look of complete terror frozen on her face. There were horrible wounds on her necks and arms. She was completely white, as if the blood had been drained out of her. My heart was beating in my chest like a jackhammer. I was starting to have difficulty breathing. I began to shake, my fingers beginning to feel numb. There was more damage than just the apparent bite marks. Her head was at an odd angle. It was obvious that her neck was broken. The cold indifference of the universe blasted my mind, and I began to sob uncontrollably. I frantically reached for the only thing I could use to defend myself, something that worked against animals, my flare gun. If there was some kind of animal down here, I knew I could scare it off. A shuffling sound caused me to back up against the tunnel wall. Something was in here with me. Nausea began to take hold of me, and my mind felt like it was swirling. I was feeling cold, but sweat was running down my face now. With trembling hands, I summoned the courage to move the flashlight into the direction to the source of the sound. My sanity was holding on for dear life now. And when I saw the thing, I thought I was going to die right on the spot. The very sight of the being, if that's what you want to call it, the very knowledge that this creature may exist, it reached right down into the greatest depths of my psyche, right down into the primal fear that exists in all living things. I wanted to retreat, but I couldn't. And this is what I saw in that dark cave system. Have you ever read a National Geographic magazine or watched the Discovery Channel?
Bigfoot.
If you have, then you're probably familiar with Otzi the Iceman. The man whose frozen corpse was frozen in a glacier for thousands of years in the Alps. That is what I could compare this being to. Its leathery discolored skin was pulled tight to its emaciated skeletal frame. Its mouth was filled with yellow razor-sharp teeth that dripped with blood. In fact, its mouth and chest were smeared with fresh blood. And this thing wasn't even looking at me. It was crouched on top of a pile of bodies that belonged to the rest of the missing family. The mother and the daughter had their throats torn out, as well as their necks broken. On top of the pile, directly beneath the creature, was the father who had the beast's face buried in his neck. Its eyes were closed as it drained the man of his blood. A terrible sucking sound came from the act, like that of a thirsty animal desperate for water. It withdrew its fangs from the poor soul's neck and proceeded to cruelly break it. It began to emit a strange guttural clicking, as if it was satisfied from its feeding. It slowly turned its head towards me, and its eyes snapped open. The eyes were like black marbles, but its pupils were red. Strange thoughts raced through my mind like, where did it come from? What were the things that it had seen throughout its inhuman existence? I felt like my mind was starting to slip. It began to stand upright, staring right at me, continuing to make that strange chattering sound. It took one step towards me, and the flare gun. I pointed it directly at the thing and pulled the damn trigger. There was a loud bang in the cave, and the entire room was lit up with a glowing red light. To my complete shock, the living nightmare was holding the burning flare in one of its hands. I retreated out of that cavernous room and bolted just as the creature let out a growl. This thing was going to kill me. I was just about to fall victim to it, just like that poor family. I ran as fast as I could, my body scraping against the cavern walls. I could see daylight just up ahead, the cavern entrance. I crawled up it as fast as I could, pushing my body to its limits. I spilled out onto the surface area, facing a bright blue sunny sky. The smoke had finally cleared, at least for now. The spruce trees gently swayed in the wind, just overhead. I clumsily got up onto my feet and backed away from the entrance to the cave. The creature never emerged from the darkness of its subterranean lair. The rest of the team hurried through the brush and found me in complete shock. I told them that I found the family down in the cave. I told them that something was down there. It wasn't long after this that armed policemen and park rangers went down there and found the remains of the family. But there was no sign of what killed them. I quit the very next day.
Do not blame you, person.
This happened when I was about 18 years old. I was big into running back then, and lived in a town that was a suburb but had lots of farms around. As in, smallish tomato and strawberry fields, not huge never-ending wheat fields. I preferred running on the dirt at the edges of those fields because it was a lot easier on my legs than running long distance on concrete or asphalt, and I was usually training for half marathons. It's about 13.1 miles for those who aren't insane enough to think running is fun. This particular day, I was planning to run an easy 6 miles. I told my mum and she suggested I do a loop and meet them back at the dog park about 3 miles from my house as my halfway point. This is the pre-cell phone era, when all the craziest shit went down. Being careful, I took a walkie-talkie my dad always used, and my mum took the other one. Now, the walkie-talkie had a range longer than the ones that my brothers and I played around with when we were younger. It definitely did not work 3 miles away, and I honestly had no idea what its exact range was. So, I take off on my run. I'm planning to go on the sidewalk for a little bit, until I get to the fields. I think it was lettuce or something then, but short small plants. I'm running in the dirt with the road a few yards to my left. I have to run south and then turn right into a slightly smaller, less travelled road to get to the dog park. As I'm running on the first part, my parents drive by, and Being dorks, they honk and wave and yell at me.
Neo's my favorite.
I wave and then soon after make my turn into the smaller road. This road is a small flat dirt one with small drainage ditches, a forever lettuce field, and then a wall that backs onto the backyards of some houses. I start noticing how quiet this street is and how few cars are passing me. Then I randomly start thinking to myself, if someone tried to do something to me, I could run to those houses. But they're quite far away, so I don't know if I would make it. Just as I'm in the middle of thinking this, I hear a car, but this one doesn't pass me like the other ones did. I hear it slow down so that it's behind me, just out of my peripheral vision. My senses go super alert and I immediately realize what a dumbass I was to pick this route because I'm stuck out here with no one to help me and nowhere to hide. The car starts speeding up enough so it's next to me, and I glance over and see a man. He's middle-aged, white, dark hair, totally normal looking, but I get a chill down my spine immediately. He sort of leans over into the passenger seat and says in a super sweet voice, "Hi, where are you going? Do you need a ride?" I am scared and realize that this is not good. Admittedly, nothing has happened yet, and he could be totally innocently just wanting to chat, but my intuition is in overdrive telling me that I am not safe. I hop over the ditch thinking at least that will make it harder for his car to follow me if I need to take off across the field to try and make it to those houses in the distance. And this pisses him off. He guns it and gets closer to the ditch and in front of where I am, and then he says in a voice that I can only describe as bone-chillingly evil, "You know, you shouldn't be out here all alone. Something horrible could happen to you out here, and no one would ever know where to find you."
That's
He's
not
put his
creepy at
car
all,
in park
guys.
and is taking off his seatbelt when I remember the walkie-talkie. The piece of crap is all staticky because I'm too far away, so I immediately turn down the volume and say loudly, "Hey Dad, yeah, I see your car. I'm over here by this red Buick. Do you see me?" And I fake wave to no one. There was no car coming from the direction my parents were, and when I had started talking, there was no one behind us either. But by the grace of the universe, at that exact moment a car turned onto the road. The guy saw it, looked at me, and sped off so fast he left skid marks. I have never run faster in my life, and I was looking behind me every few seconds and thought he'd be waiting for me at every intersection I had to cross. I was shaking, I was so scared, and relieved when I got to that fucking dog park. I told my parents everything, and my mum called the cops. They took a statement but said that there wasn't actually much that they could do because nothing had really happened. But the weird part was that I was having trouble getting my story out because I was so upset. And before I gave a description of the car, the cop asked me, "Hey, was it a red Buick?" He wouldn't tell us why, but that just added to my feeling that I had narrowly escaped something awful. Back in December of 2007, when I was 17, my mum, my sister Andre, and our cat Whiskers had all moved to Staten Island into a 4-bedroom and 1-bath house. We couldn't afford to buy a house, and ended up finding one that was up for rent for a pretty reasonable price. Staten Island is also known as the Forgotten Borough, and is also considered the most suburban part of New York City. My mum had always wanted to live in a house, especially in Staten Island, since most of our family had already lived there. The street we lived in was really quiet and decent looking, and was also a dead-end street. All the houses had their own unique styles, and you could tell that they had been there for quite some time. There was one house in particular on the street that looked really strange and abandoned. The house did not look like the usual houses in the neighborhood. Some of the windows were boarded up and the other had broken and dirty white blinds on them. The paint on the side of the house was tearing off, but you could tell that the house was once a baby blue color. The front of the house looked like a tornado had went through it, and the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in years. Needless to say, there were also 2 abandoned cars in it, one of which was a 1961 black Chevy Impala that sat in the driveway of the house, and the other was a 1959 red Cadillac that sat in the tall grass in the backyard of the house. We just thought that the house was abandoned and that the people had left years ago. We all had hoped that someday someone would clean up the property, renovate and sell it. I was also fascinated with the house though. I wondered if it was haunted, had anyone died recently or years ago there, what valuables were left behind. I would often try and go and peek through the broken blinds, but saw nothing but darkness, even in the daytime. It wasn't until one of these moments when I saw a light flick from the upstairs attic in that house one late night. I was a huge fan of horror movies, and felt like, at that moment, that I may have seen one too many or something. I was up doing a late assignment while watching movies, and must have been tired. So I thought. I peeked through the blinds of my window, and it was still on. I ran into my mother's room and told her about the light, but by the time she had gotten up, the light had turned off. She went outside and searched around outside, but found nothing. But I saw something as she came back into the house. There was an old Volkswagen pulling up to the side of the abandoned house with the headlights on. A family with a husband, wife, and 3 kids got out. The 3 kids were older girls. One was a teenager, the other looked to be preteen, and the youngest had to be about 7 or 8 years old. They dressed differently, like they were from a different time period or something. I just thought maybe they were just religious and didn't believe in certain stuff or something. They all looked disorientated and dazed, but it was also 1 in the morning. They never said a word. They just went into this abandoned house, and for the first time in 3 months, the lights all came on, but went off in seconds. My mother stood there in shock and could not believe that these people lived in that house. Maybe it's nice on the inside, my mother said as she shrugged her shoulders and went back to bed. At this point, I was even more fascinated. We had never seen these people, ever. And obviously, they would come out mostly in the nighttime and rarely in the daytime. I used to wonder if the kids were homeschooled, or maybe attending boarding school and coming home once in a while. Whatever it was, they were pretty creepy and weird. My mother, sister and I started nicknaming them the Addams family, and calling the
Addams
house
family.
the Addams family.
It's the
house because
Addams
it looked exactly like the
family.
structure of the house they showed on the TV. Those people were weird. We never knew their names, and even the kids never said anything, and you would think that they would be the most interactive ones. But no. They were just really quiet, and things just got creepier. One day, I noticed a foul odor coming from somewhere. We couldn't find it, but it smelt like death, like an animal had died. My mother opened one of the windows in the house and was shocked to see a swarm of huge flies flying around the basement window of the house next door. When you looked at it, you could see the flies on the inside of the house, as well as on the outside. It really creeped us out. We didn't call the police, but we were really scared. When my uncle came over for a visit later on that day, we told him about the incident. Now, my uncle is a skilled hunter and survivalist, and he went around to the neighbor's house, and the smell was so horrid that even he threw up. We ended up calling the police, but by that time, the smell and the flies were already gone by the time they showed up, and so there wasn't anything that they could do. One night, the day before Thanksgiving, my mother and I were preparing some food for the next day. My mother likes to get a head start on the cooking. We were expecting a good amount of people this time. Aunts, cousins, uncles, and older siblings. My cat Whispers suddenly let out a yawl and began scratching at the door to let him in. Once I opened the door, he jumped into my arms and wouldn't let me put him down. I held him as I peeked through the blinds to see what had spooked him, only to see a man dressed in dark clothing that seemed to be staring back at me. He then turned his back towards me and faced the house. I told my mother what had happened, and she told me not to worry and that the whole family was creepy and needed help. My cat let out another yawl and then started meowing uncontrollably and still did not want me to put him down. When I looked towards the window, I noticed orange flames in our window. Is that a fire?
Mum, I think there's a fire outside.
My sister, mother, and I, with my cat in my arms, ran outside. The next door neighbour's house was on fire. It was engulfed with flames and now it was on our windows. And the man I saw just stood there with no remorse as his entire home burned. As his home burned, his face glistened along with the fire and the moonlight as he looked back at me with dark hazy eyes. I will never forget that look as long as I live. The police and fire trucks got there just in time and were able to put out the fire, but the house was really badly burnt. To my surprise and my mum's relief, the fire only touched our windows and didn't do much damage to our house. But within the moments of us looking at the house and the police coming, the man had suddenly disappeared without a trace or sound. The cops weren't able to catch him and continuously sent patrol cars to watch over the house. They asked the neighborhood questions about the people that lived there. The crazy thing was that no one knew who they were, how long they lived there, and where they might have gone. It was just a total mystery. That family had suddenly vanished without a trace. I also found out through an older lady that lived in the neighborhood since the 1950s that a family had once died in that house in a fire back in 1963, and the family had 3 daughters. And can you believe it? One was a teenager, the other was a preteen, and the youngest was about 7 or 8 years old. She said that the father was a very sinister and overzealous man who controlled his wife and family. She also said that even though the fire was ruled accidental, she had no doubt in her mind that the father was the one who set it off in the first place. Eventually, the cops grew tired and stopped coming around. They had no leads and no one was coming forward. And the house laid vacant, just the way it was when we first moved next door. After a few quiet months, my mother decided to move the family again this time to a house that she bought, just on the other side of Staten Island. As we were leaving the house that night, during the late summer of 2009, and packing the rest of our things into the U-Haul, I could not help but look at the abandoned house just once more. And as soon as we drove away, the light in the attic of that home flicked on again.
Interesting story. Oh, I got it. Did I get it? No, I didn't. Fuck.
It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a crossroad country trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is a very long and very barren drive. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of much more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear that you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert again and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe that it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and the women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way through the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the only other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild grey hair, almost shoulder length if it hadn't been sticking out every direction from her head. It looked like it hadn't been brushed in weeks. She was wearing ragged looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitted black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. There were several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging on her shoulder, crooked, like she hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly. She was also carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes had a wild, alive look. She looked at me like she was hungry, and this is when I felt the first tinge of something was wrong. I just tried to brush it off, though. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door, because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body more angled toward me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to act or something. Her hands were not by her face or trying to fix a mess of hair or even being washed. They were at her sides, elbows also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I felt the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open and then slammed closed. The door was pretty heavy and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, and then paused, fingers only an inch from the lock. I stayed as silent as I could manage to confirm what I had just thought I heard.
How you guys doing? How you doing, buddy?
It was breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave.
Just so you know, I'm watching some.
At this point,
well, I shouldn't
was
say watching,
scared
but I'm listening
and
to some
confused.
horror stories.
Why
from
had
Be
she tried to
Busta,
trick me
linked in
into
the
thinking
description.
that she had left, only to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time it must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time, I waited a few minutes to make sure that she hadn't tried a trick again. I slipped out of the stall, quickly washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside, and I had no idea where she was, but I knew that she couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store, and quietly slipped out of the door behind him. And sure enough, crouched right outside of the front door is the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay since I had taken so much longer than usual, and I said I would tell him all about it once we were away from that store. Other people who have heard my story have had many theories, but the two most common were that she was a druggie that wanted to mug me, or that she worked with sex trafficking or something. I am open to any of your theories and would like to hear some suggestions. I tried to see if there was anything in the news from around that time, but I couldn't figure out exactly where we were when this happened.
Ooh, I finally got it.
This story is about my mum. She's been living in the same house for about 12 years now. It's in a shady neighborhood. Lots of gang activity and sirens can always be heard not far away. I can't count the number of times the convenience store across the street has been robbed since we moved in. But we were never really concerned, as my mother created an unquestionably comfortable home, and I always felt safe. In 2013, when my father died, she adopted a dog for company, as it was just her living in the house at the time when this incident occurred. The dog is yappy, sweet as hell, but any sort of noise outside, whether it's a car door slamming or our mailman, she will bark, and bark, and bark, and bark. This can be scary if it catches you off guard, or if it's late at night. But of course, it's also reassuring that she is so alert. And that is exactly what happened. My mother told me that it was late one night, maybe 2 a.m. She was getting ready for bed. She stays up late watching investigative discovery and the like. There are 2 doors that must be opened to
What
get
is it
inside
with
the
old people
house.
watching the ID
The
channel?
front door has a large window and opens into a porch where she
I find
keeps a
that
deep
interesting.
freezer. There is a larger metal door after the porch, which opens directly into the living room of her house. She locks it every night before she goes to bed. She likes to sleep on the couch in the living room. She claims her bed upstairs hurts her back. So, one night, all of a sudden her dog started barking her head off. At first, my mum scolded her, assuming that she had heard a car pass by or something. But then, my mum heard it too. Someone was knocking on the front door. The doors had muffled the sound of the knock, but it was someone knocking. My mum sat there silently contemplating what to do, and hoping whoever it was would just go away. But it persisted, as her dog did. Now, my mother wasn't born yesterday. She's a tough old bird, and won't take anyone's shit. She opened the metal door and went to the window. Lifting the blinds, she saw a disheveled girl standing on the front step. My mum thought that she was perhaps drunk, as she was unsteady on her feet and slurred when she spoke. My mum asked what she wanted. "Is Danielle here?" The woman asked. No. There's no one here by that name, sorry." My mum responded politely. She dropped the blinds and was about to go back into the house. But then, the woman started pounding on the door this time, with force. Lots of force, in fact. My mum thought that she had been kicking it.
Let me in.
She screamed. At this point, my mum was irked. She goes back to the front door, lifts the blind again, and adamantly tells this woman to fuck off, that there's no one there named Danielle.
Fuck off.
This woman finally left, but it wasn't until the next day that my mum realised the trouble she could have been in if she had opened the door that night. Her front yard is surrounded by a short metal fence, about waist high. She gives us hell any time that we forget to close the gate. And when she was retrieving the morning paper, she noticed this woman had left the gate open. Annoyed again, she put on her slippers to go outside to close it. And that's when she saw it. Laying on the ground beside our walkway was a crowbar. My mum then understood what the force was that was used to pound on the front door. She had no idea that the woman was holding it. The window itself can see a person on the other side from about chest up, and it had been dark. Who knows what could have happened if my mother decided to open the door that night.
Who would know? Dun dun dun!
This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult. To come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was really excited, though sad to leave all of my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like, go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. Oh, and you'll have to park on the street because the apartment complex has limited parking. One more thing. There's this neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone, for one reason, my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man to make a show of being in their place. It could have been a brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman, or what he looked like. George would just simply back off, immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who is also quite tall and rather big, or intimidating, I felt confident that I would be alright. And I was, for a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more, until she got up and left him. One night I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever.
Bad, bro.
I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, just staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette, and shakily, I stubbed it out and just went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all of my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself then I was probably just paranoid. The next morning, I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee, and lo and behold, minutes after I got onto my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple of weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door, peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex had already tried to call the police about George. But he lives in the complex, and staring isn't a crime. So, there wasn't much that they could do.
Wish it was, don't you?
I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before. And with that info in my mind, I knew that calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to a parking spot. So I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment, depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of those paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind a tree.
Hey guys.
It was like he thought that I couldn't see him.
I should say, hi person.
I mean, picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You can
This is
see
what I've done
90%
so
of their
far.
body, and you know that they're there. That's what he would do. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe,
Hey, don't be
my mum was
shy.
trying
If
to
you
find
wanna
me some free self-defense
send a
classes,
message in the chat,
since
you know,
I
I'll
couldn't afford
talk to
anything
you.
on my tight budget.
Be honest, it gets a little
My
lonely
dad was
just
steadily
listening
getting
to
more
these
and more
stuff.
pissed off as George edged closer and closer, escalating as the days went by. It went from November all the way to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if they needed to. I even put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall, out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. I had terrible nightmares too. Then one day, my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?"
Of course, people
No.
gossiping.
"He got arrested last night."
The story of my
In the
life.
complex parking lot, there's a sort of big electrical power box. It stands about waist height and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home,
Person
and
left.
parked right in front of it, some lady with her kid walking by saw George sitting on the box, masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him there? Ugh, the thought of it makes me want to puke
It's not
and
gross at all.
scares me
Ew.
all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same old routine. One night, though, he got
Hello,
far
person.
braver. It was maybe
Yes, I
7
do keep
p.m.
an eye on my
I went out for a
viewers.
cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "That dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to
Sorry
the
for the
neighbor some
cursing.
more. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting.
Where are you?
But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured that she was just talking to someone else. That is, until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot, frantically, like she was doing the potty dance or something. "He's bleeding!" "Who?" I asked, in bewilderment. "Your dad! Come quick!" I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it or something. When I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor, Caleb, held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he'd been mauled by a bear or something. That was seriously my first thought. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed everywhere. I feel queasy even writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. I mean, blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30 or 40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked, aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turn to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we keep our towels. She rushed to go and grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said.
Shut up.
"What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911 and relayed our address and reason for emergency. The operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in. Then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly, and I wanted to scream at them to run. I mean, my dad could be bleeding out. Don't they care? I learned later that they don't run because if they do, they'll let their adrenaline kick in, and mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when the police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so that I could give them a statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all of his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. 2 years later, and all of these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police, and they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad, and once I called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was really nice to me. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, there were 14 cop cars. 14. He still just kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt so much hatred, like I'd never felt before. I wanted to just go over and kill him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back to my house where I waited for the information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come tell me that to my face like a man." So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand and then got my dad in the back with the knife.
Ooh.
It missed his kidney very, very narrowly. It traveled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize that he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him. thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney or something. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail, unfortunately. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week, while I was on my porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain that he would be away for good. Several poor women
Person watching,
had
do you want to
George
say hi in
stalk
chat,
them
please?
up to their apartment door and pull his pants down, demanding sex. I still can't believe that the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to tell me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place.
Jeez.
They were buried in gardens, stuck behind trees,
Ew, I
under
don't
his
like
doormat, everywhere. I shudder to think that he might have planned to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever. My dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad now. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing alright now. He's just had his third surgery on Tuesday, trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that this will be the last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't have fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed.
I always wondered what like these voices are saying.
G'day mates, it's Be Busta here. So, as I'm sure that all of you are well aware by now, the YouTube adpocalypse has hit the wallets of many content creators, and none more so than the horror community here on YouTube. As such, the money I'm now earning from YouTube ad revenue is no longer enough for me to survive on. And while this has been distressing for me and others, this doesn't need to be the end of my channel or horror on YouTube. You can keep YouTube creepy and keep my channel operating by pledging as little as $1 a month on Patreon. It's really simple, guys. All you have to do is go on my Patreon account, which is in the description below, and pledge as much or as little as you wish. And as a way of giving back to you guys, if the show can become fully fan funded, I will remove all mid-roll ads from all of my YouTube videos. Also, to be completely transparent, currently I'm averaging about $300 to $400 a week on Patreon, which is getting really close to sustainability. I need roughly about $700 to $800 a week to pay all of my bills and look after my family and everything, which means we're about halfway to becoming completely independent from YouTube. So if only 400 more of you gave $1 a month, that would put me in a place where I no longer need to be concerned about what YouTube is doing anymore, which in the current climate would be awesome. So if you have $1 or $2 to spare, please consider making a pledge today. And thank you to all those who have already pledged and who will pledge. Your support right now has kept the lights on for me and my family, and I appreciate all of you very much. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoy the video, and without further ado, let's begin.
Love the Australian. Oh, jeez.
A few years ago, I went to New Orleans on vacation with my then boyfriend. We stayed at this really cute bed and breakfast, just outside of the French Quarter, which was 2 mansions across the street from
I
each other
have no
that were
idea what to
converted.
make the color of the skirt.
On the first night, we were lying in bed watching television after a long day, when suddenly, violent punching from beneath the mattress made us both leap out of bed. The punching was strong enough that the mattress undulated where the punching was coming from, and repeated enough times for me to not think it was a spring.
I'll do that.
After taking a moment to calm down, we both checked under the bed. Nothing. We eventually went back to bed, but didn't sleep much that night. On the second night, my boyfriend woke up at around 4 a.m. to see someone or something he thought was me exit the restroom and make their or its way to the bed.